Hey everyone, welcome to this week's episode of the Sleep Like a Boss podcast, where we're going to talk about a topic that is close to my heart, at least a part of it, and that is sleep and anxiety. And we're going to dive into the sleep and anxiety question. We're going to go even a bit further and go into OCD. And I have an expert here. I'm so happy to have her, Jenna Overbaugh. I'm super excited to have you on the show. We're going to dive into your CV in a minute. So welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to be here. Sleep is just fascinating, and I'm sure people will be able to leave this podcast episode with some tips and hopefully feeling a little bit better.
Yeah, and that's our goal today, because anxiety really is a topic that comes up so much when we talk about sleep, and that is something I think that hinders people's sleep in a lot of cases. But before we dive into that, let's dive into your CV, Jenna, and maybe you can talk the people through your what you're doing, what your background is, what your story is, and how you're helping people right now.
Yeah, so I was always an anxious kid, honestly. That's kind of how this all started. So I remember very early on, being very anxious with school, having a stomach ache before school, not wanting to go. I also remember not sleeping very well. But I do remember always just wanting to do it and get it over with. Like anything that was anxiety provoking or hard or that I was wanting to avoid, I just wanted to kind of rip the Band-Aid off and get it over with. And that was just always what I thought was the best thing to do. It was kind of just how I lived my life. But when I went to college, I learned that modality is actually an evidence-based treatment. It's called exposure and response prevention for specifically anxiety and anxiety-related conditions, and also obsessive compulsive disorder. And so I just became really enveloped in exposure and response prevention, learning everything that I possibly could about it. Just really quickly, the whole premise behind it is that you do difficult things. You put yourself outside of your comfort zone, and the more that you do that, the more that you reduce your avoidance, the better that you feel, the more confident and more empowered that you feel. And so just since then, really, since 2008 or so, I've been specializing in OCD and other anxiety conditions. I've worked with kids and adolescents. I've worked at all levels of care, including 8 years in one of the most world-renowned residential OCD and anxiety treatment facilities. That's where we met and treated some of the most debilitating cases of OCD and anxiety in the world. Lots of sleep issues there, as you can imagine. They lived with us for 24/7 for 4 or 5 or 6 months. And we were watching them all throughout the clock, and so many anxiety related conditions and interrupted sleep. And it was more common that people had sleep issues than if they didn't have sleep issues. Out of the 28 members or residents that we had in that facility at any time, maybe one of those individuals of the 28 slept well. So goes to show when you have, anxiety and OCD or related conditions, your sleep is probably going to be affected, and that your lack of sleep or interrupted sleep is going to also affect your anxiety and affect your OCD. So, but now I work at nOCD, which is a teletherapy platform. We provide services for people who have OCD and anxiety. It's also a free app. And I have my own podcast. I'm on Instagram now trying to spread awareness, but I am still a practicing therapist. So yeah, I'm kind of all over the place. But again, just really enthusiastic about the link and the relationship between OCD, anxiety, and sleep, and hopefully can help some tired people out there.
Yeah, and that is really great. And can we maybe, to set the stage, can you describe or define anxiety, and can you differentiate OCD from that?
Sure. So when we're talking about disorders, right? I mean, I think we all have anxiety. When it comes to something that's more diagnosable, right? We're talking about stress and impairment. So to what degree is this anxiety, or are these obsessions and compulsions causing distress and impairment in your life? So, if you're out there and you have some anxiety, but it's not really causing too much distress or impairment in your day-to-day functioning, it's probably not something that might warrant a diagnosis. But if it is causing distress and impairment in your day-to-day functioning, that's where it might be considered kind of that abnormal or clinical level of what we would call generalized anxiety disorder, is the fancy, appropriate, and formal name for it. So we have generalized anxiety disorder, which is in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, kind of, our recipe book for diagnostic material. And then we have obsessive compulsive disorder. And years ago, they were under the same tree. They were all considered kind of anxiety related conditions, because obviously there's tons of overlap. There's features of anxiety, there's features of safety behaviors. But recent literature has shown that there are certain brain mechanisms that are at play and influenced in OCD that is not necessarily seen in just generalized anxiety disorder. So now they are separate, but they're obviously still very overlapped. But when we're talking about the specifics, when we're talking about generalized anxiety disorder, technically, according to the DSM, that's where somebody experiences a lot of recurrent worries and concerns about more real life and kind of relatable issues, right? So that's going to be things like our health, the health and well-being of others, the environment, the future, death, things like that, things that are kind of more, for lack of a better word, more general, kind of more down to earth. And then we have obsessive compulsive disorder, and the diagnostic kind of code for that is recurrent obsessions, which are thoughts, ideas, images, impulses, or feelings that are very intrusive, they're unwanted. But then they also exhibit these compulsions, which are these mental behaviors or physical things that they feel compelled to do. They don't want to do these things, but they feel compelled to do them. And in both of those cases, right, these are very distressing, these are very impactful and interfering with their activities of daily living. So food, sleep is a big one, ability to work and take care of yourself. So there's a lot of overlap here, but if you could think of it kind of on a spectrum, right? Like generalized anxiety disorder is more generalized, again, for lack of a better term, whereas OCD, it's a lot more intrusive. The best analogy that has really hit home for people with me is that generalized anxiety kind of feels like that rolling thunder in the background. Like it's kind of always there, but it's not really like as front and center. It's not as threatening potentially, but it's always there, kind of looming in the background. Whereas OCD can feel like that bolt of thunder, like it can just hit really immediately, and it is very focused at times. And you can definitely have both of those conditions too. So, it's very nuanced, but hopefully that's helpful for people to see the difference between the two.
Okay, great. Thank you. And if I look at what we talk about a lot with our clients, like anxiety is a thing that always comes up with regards to, or not always, but for a lot of people. And it seems to me that as soon as someone hasn't slept, and I was like that too, as soon as I hadn't slept for like 3-4 weeks and there were issues with sleep and I just couldn't get back to where I had been, the stories start popping up. Oh my God, I'm not going to, the biggest one for me was I'm not going to be able to function tomorrow. How I'm going to take care of my little one, how I'm going to do at work. I'm exhausted. How is this going to even work? I might get sick because I've heard sleep is important for immune function. Then some people take this even further, as in I'm going to die early or soon because I'm not getting 8 hours of sleep. And it just becomes such a vicious cycle, it almost seems, right? That when we have anxiety, we can't sleep. And when we can't sleep, we have anxiety.
Yep.
It's
like what came first, the chicken or the egg, right? And yeah, that totally happens. Like I said, in my experience working at residential, everyone seemingly had issues with sleep. And it was typically those more unstructured, alone downtimes where people would really struggle with these mental, this mental cycle. Call it worrying, call it obsessing, call it ruminating, whatever it is that you want to call it. It's exactly what you just said. It's all these questions that are very doom filled. It's kind of like, oh my gosh, what about this? And what about this? It's kind of like worrying, but it doesn't actually end up going anywhere, right? Like worrying is functional if it leads to problem solving. But when we just stay focused on the problem and we're just in this cyclical, repetitive pattern of like just spinning our wheels over the problem, and we're not actually taking that physical, like actual logistical step forward and problem solving and identifying solutions and doing trial and error, then we become, obsessive, anxious, ruminating. Again, call it whatever it is that you want, but it's that story. And what's really interesting is that we as humans, I read recently that as humans, we are the only species that have the capacity to think ahead, like into the future. So they did this really cool study where they took a bunch of animals, namely monkeys of various kinds, and they basically had this mechanism that looked like an upside down Y. It was like a little like straight up and down rod with then two like angled tubes coming out of it. And they kept putting this treat down, like down the top of it. And obviously it was 50-50, right? The treat would either come down the left or it would come down the right. And no matter what, no matter how many trials that the monkey was put through, it never put both hands under both of the tubes. It always just went for one or the other. And so it just goes to show, like, we are the only species that have this really wonderful capacity to think forward into the future and to use that ability to change our course of action and to problem solve, right? Like, oh my gosh, I didn't sleep. What if I get sick? That should lead us into effective problem solving, which is, oh, I got to ask for help so that I can go to bed a little bit earlier tonight, or I am going to sleep when the baby sleeps. So, even though I feel like I can't, something's got to give. I need to do something different. And so that mechanism is very evolutionarily wise for us to have adapted. It's supposed to lead to effective problem solving, but for a lot of us, it doesn't. We just keep thinking the same thing over and over and over and over again. And so my advice to those people who are in that story, and it happens to all of us, including me, is to one, try to recognize it as soon as possible. Like, yep, just being mindful, paying attention to the present moment on purpose. I'm going there again. And ask yourself, like, is what I'm doing actually problem solving? Like, I'm just sitting here thinking about the problem, or am I actually like, what can I do about this? What can I do differently? We don't want to be that monkey that's just like one hand under one hole and then next time under the other hole. We have to do something differently. Otherwise, yeah, we stay stuck in that cycle.
Yeah, I think that's it's such a great point, because when you were just saying that with the monkey and our ability to look into the future and problem solve is great. I think we a lot of times misuse it.
Yes.
And be anxious and are anxious about it, right? I think that's exactly what you meant with the thoughts are coming over and over, and we're doing that same pattern again. And we kind of don't differentiate. Is this real, or is that the story, right? Now our brain just doesn't know. I'm worrying about the future. I like either I can change it and I make a plan to change it. And if I can't change it, I have to kind of try and not worry about it, because
and so many people have these like positive, it's called positive attributions of worry, right? Like they believe that worrying equals problem solving, but it doesn't, right? Like you have to acknowledge that to a certain point, you are just continuing to think about the problem. So of all the issues that I see being related to sleep, like as in preventing people from sleep, I think it's that. Like they're down, it's an unstructured time. The day is over, they're not being busy and distracted by all the things of the day. And then they're kind of left, right? Like with this blankness in their mind and nothing to kind of distract them. And then all the questions come, all the reminders of what could have gone wrong that day, all of the reminders of the scary things that are coming. And then, yeah, we are that monkey, like one hand under each of the tubes, but it's like, we have to make a decision, right? We have to make a decision. We can't solve those things right now. And we have to let that go. And I think too, one of the best things that I have ever been taught and have therefore taught others about sleep is that when you're sleeping, your only job, or when you're trying to sleep, rather, when you're laying down to sleep, your only job is to really set yourself up for sleep. Like you can't force yourself to sleep, right? So especially when we get into this unhelpful pattern of, oh my gosh, no, I'm not sleeping. I've been laying here for an hour. Oh my gosh, I'm going to be so tired tomorrow. Why can't I just sleep? Oh my gosh. That just, as we all know, makes it a million times worse. We get further and further from sleep. I always try to remind people that your only job is to set yourself up for sleep. You're supposed to do all the things, right? Like all the basic sleep hygiene things that everybody would tell you that you could easily Google. Your job is to lay there, try not to make sleep come any harder, right? By like not engaging in these stories and whatever. Your job is to just lay there, rest your eyes and rest your body. Sleep will come if it's meant to, right? And chances are that it will. but your only job is to really sit there and rest. So that kind of, I feel like, takes the pressure off for people sometimes. Like, okay, my only job is to sit here and rest. Maybe the sleep will come, maybe it won't, but usually it does.
Yes, absolutely. And I think how you described it, this, oh, I'm going to hit the pillow, it's quiet, the monkey brain comes on, and then we just go. Do you have tips for people on how to handle that, or, well, either in the situation or to not even let that situation occur?
So I always like to think of it as, we can't help the thoughts that pop up, but we can help the thoughts that we conjure up, right? So allowing the thoughts to come and go. And, yep, I noticed those thoughts. I'm not gonna, I'm not thinking about that right now. I'm not gonna solve that problem right now. My job is to just sit here and rest. And I think it takes a little bit of mindfulness. I think a lot of times people mistake mindfulness as being this really rigorous, structured practice of having to meditate and like be all Zen. And sure, you can do that, but mindfulness is just paying attention on purpose. And so really paying attention to where your thoughts are going and the story that your brain is trying to go down, and realizing that you are not necessarily in control of the thoughts that pop up. The scarier reminders of this presentation you have to do 5 days from now, or that reminder of that really embarrassing thing that you did earlier, or that really frustrating thought that, oh my gosh, I haven't slept yet. But you are responsible for what you conjure up. Do you go down that rabbit hole of, oh my gosh, now I'm going to get sick, and oh my gosh, I can't get sick, and I need to take care of my baby, and oh my God, or can we just notice that and say, yep, that's not something that I can control right now. I'm here resting. I'm doing the best that I can. I'm going to let that go. A lot of times these worries, call them obsessions, they come in the form of questions. So like, well, what about that presentation? Or, how are you supposed to get to sleep right now? Or, did you actually do this? Did you actually lock up the office right before you left? And it's like, your job is just to not answer the questions, right? Like, you can let the questions be there. Your job in the middle of the night when you can't sleep is to not answer those questions. And eventually I think of these obsessions and these anxieties almost like a telemarketer, right? Like, you've been answering the phone probably for a while. And so it's going to keep calling, right? Like, it's in the middle of the night, like when you can't sleep, those intrusive thoughts or those worries are going to keep coming at you. Because it's used to you answering at that time. And so it's going to take some time for them to quiet down. But as you practice the mindfulness that we're speaking of, and as you practice not trying to solve these problems at 2:00 in the morning, and as you practice, just letting the thoughts pop up without conjuring up additional anxiety provoking thoughts, eventually that telemarketer will kind of get the point that, this isn't working anymore. And this doesn't warrant a response at 2:00 in the morning.
What's your thought on if that happens sometimes, and there's like a list, like, sometimes you wake up and you have this to-do list in your mind, and it's like, oh my God, I have to do this. This, like, just write these things down and then go back to sleep and potentially revisit the next day to actually see how some of this is not, like, it's not the end of the world.
I think the worst thing that somebody could do is probably to like get up out of bed and actually do the thing, right?
Yeah.
Like, I always get so, I guess, like, not frustrated is the right word, but like, I hear from so many people that like, oh yeah, I couldn't sleep, so I got up and just like paced around my house, or I got up and I like cleaned the house. And it's like, did you think that you were going to sleep while you were doing those things? Like, no, right? And so I think, like, if you do have this thing like, oh, I got to send this email, right? Like, I think the worst thing that you could do for your sleep at that time is to just like, yes, urgently get up and go and do it. Because again, like, I think that probably sends some messages to your brain too, that like, this needs to be taken care of now, and sleep isn't as important as doing this thing.
Yeah.
So I think it's probably the worst thing that you could do. I would love it if everybody could, kind of just say like, yep, I'll get to that tomorrow. We'll see, I'll get to that tomorrow. My job right now is to rest my body, and if sleep happens, then sleep happens. My job right now is to rest my body. If that feels way too hard, then sure, I think like a reduced version of like actually getting up and taking care of it. Sure. Like, make a little note of it, put it on your phone, a reminder or whatever. But again, like, your job at that time is to rest your body and to set yourself up for sleep, essentially.
And are there things that you would suggest people do maybe during the day to not even get to that? I rest my head on the pillow and my brain starts going into thinking mode.
I mean, I think that for most people, I don't think that it's the situation where like, oh yeah, I only worry at night when I hit the pillow, right? Like they probably engage in those types of processes throughout the day. Um, so yeah, I mean, I think it's always of benefit to, not engage in those anxiety provoking kind of worries or, make them worse, kind of just allowing the thoughts to come and go, I think is really just general good practice. And by practicing it throughout the day, right? Like when it's actually time for nighttime, you'll probably be better able and be better equipped, right? So, these muscles of allowing your thoughts to come and go and being mindful, and not responding to your anxiety provoking thoughts or your worries or obsessions and just letting them come and go, that's kind of a muscle, right? And so, if you think about, in order to get that muscle to be stronger for a competition or for a race or whatever, you have to practice that muscle and build that muscle when it's not race time, right? Like you have to go to the gym and you have to practice. So I would say, yeah, like the same things that we're talking about, which is practicing mindfulness, allowing those anxiety provoking thoughts to come and go, not mistaking worrying for problem solving, not just trying to hit the ground running at 9 o'clock or 10 o'clock at night, but rather trying to practice that throughout the day so that when you go to sleep, things feel a little bit like not so foreign because you've been practicing it already that day.
Yeah, and I think that's such an important point. And thinking, and I can talk about myself and I can talk about clients that I've worked with. And a lot of clients who I work with are very go, 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 super successful professionals. And I was like that too. No, I don't have time for that thought right now, but you kind of push it away. And that is different from having it come and go, right? It's this, if we just push things away, they will pop up at night because you've never had time or you never made time during the day to actually allow them to come. It's this, like have to get the kids now, have to like jump into a meeting on a Zoom call, whatever, don't have time, which you might not, fair point, because you don't want to talk about your anxiety on that meeting with a client, but really allowing that to then come back if it wants to before it's 9 or 10 o'clock at night. I think, and not
absolutely.
just.
And I think related to that, I think so many times people will hear what we're saying and they'll confuse it with like thought suppression, which is like, don't think about that scary thought. Don't think about that scary thought. Don't think about what you have to do at work tomorrow. Don't think about what you have to do at work tomorrow. Do not think about that scary presentation. Don't think about sleep. Just do not think about sleep. And it's like, that is clearly thought suppression, right? Like, don't think about XYZ. They've done tons of research to show, if you tell someone, don't think about a white elephant, don't think about a white elephant, or don't think about a pink squirrel or whatever, they have a rebound effect where they think about that more. And so it seems very nuanced, but there's a difference between allowing a thought to come and go and not hooking into it versus suppressing that thought and trying to get rid of it. It's acceptance versus get rid of.
Yeah.
We're going to allow the thoughts to be there and, continue to go get our kids, continue to bring it back to restful sleep and laying down in our bed without saying, oh my gosh, don't think about that. Don't think about that. Don't think about that. Because as we do the don't think about it, they just come back more and there's a rebound effect.
Yeah, absolutely. And what other tools do you use or recommend for people to either have those thoughts come or calm their mind or handle worries and anxiety? Because you're an expert in that. Are there things that you can share outside of a therapy session with people that they can use?
Yeah. So especially when it comes to worry or, ruminating, that might be a familiar term to some people out there. We would encourage people to try to resist that, right? Like try not to go down the rabbit hole and try to, sit with that uncertainty is kind of what we say in our field, like to sit with the uncertainty. Like, yeah, you might get sick tomorrow. We don't know that with 100% certainty. And a lot of times all these fears, like the fears that you had mentioned, just kind of as examples, like, oh my gosh, what if I can't function tomorrow? What if I can't handle the baby? What if I get sick? So many of our fears, regardless of if we have OCD or generalized anxiety or whatever, it always ends up being this like very core fear of I can't handle it.
Mm-hmm.
Like, okay, well, if I'm so tired and I'm with the baby, I'm not going to be able to take care of her and I can't handle it. I'm going to get so stressed out and so exhausted and feel so miserable that I can't handle it. I'm going to get so sick and that's going to make everything so much harder and I can't handle it. It's like we all are, at the end of the day, like these things all lead back to this like very central fear of us not being able to handle something, which is kind of silly considering that we've literally handled every single thing that's ever come our way before. It might not have been pretty, it might not have been glorious or fun or easy, but we've handled everything. And so chances, if you're worried about being so tired that you might get sick tomorrow, that could happen. Like there's no amount of worrying that you could do. There's no amount of, sleep hygiene. There's no amount of, sleep rituals that you could do that would 100% protect you from that. So the sooner that we can kind of accept that may happen, I think that the sooner that we can all kind of like just stop holding our breath so much and just realizing like whatever happens, I'll be able to handle it. I've handled whatever it is that I've gone through before. And I think that is probably like the biggest takeaway for people. That's all of these fears tend to come back down to this false idea that we won't be able to handle something. But the reality is that we've always handled things. We've been tired before. And it might not have been the best day at work. We might have been a little bit testy with our kids the next day. But that's all life and we'll handle that, right? Like we'll handle it. We'll handle that just like we've handled everything else. So I think that even just like that reminder, it helps me get through. It helps me remind myself that like, it's not going to be the end of the world. And so often these things that we worry about at night or when we can't sleep, right? It's like, these things are nowhere near as probable as we think they are. These things are not as catastrophic as we think they are. And so it's just, I hope everybody can kind of like stop holding their breath so much for these awful things to happen, and realize that they can handle it. They've handled everything so far.
Yeah, I think it's exactly that. And we seem to over dramatize things in bed as well when we lay there and it's so quiet that just blows up. And yes, you're absolutely right. We're here, we've done it, and we're going to keep doing things. And it's just, it might not be a super energy filled day the next day if you didn't get that rest, but that's fine. We'll get through it and there'll be a better next day after that.
Yeah,
and
absolutely. And it's our job to, accept that might happen and to not take that any further than it needs to go, right? Like the fact that we are having a hard time sleeping right now, that's true. And we can just stay there, right? Like we don't have to get absorbed into this OCD story or this anxiety story of me not sleeping well right now equals a horrible day tomorrow, equals me not being able to take care of my baby, equals me getting sick, equals me not being able to handle it and having a mental breakdown. Like we can just stay right here, which is that I'm having a hard time sleeping right now. We don't have to get evolved and absorbed into this story. And we do that all the time. So, my best advice, in addition to what we've talked about, is, challenging people to stay where they're at, like be where you're at, stay right there. Those things are real. Not sleeping is horrible. It stinks to not sleep. And we also don't have to we don't have to cross that bridge into the obsessive or anxiety ridden story of what that all means and what's going to happen as a result of that.
Great. Thank you so much. Would you like to share a bit about where people can find you? Because I've seen your social media. I think it's fantastic.
Thanks.
Yeah, it's really educational. It's really great. It's really helpful. I think there's great tips there. Where can people find you?
Yeah, so I do hang out probably a little bit too much on Instagram over at Jenna.Overbaugh. So just my first and last name with a period in between. I also have my own podcast where I go way more in depth about this content and these topics. It's called All the Hard Things. And if anybody out there is struggling and wants some free resources, I work for nOCD. Again, we're a teletherapy app. We provide teletherapy services to people who have OCD and anxiety, but it's also a free app where you can go and learn a ton of resources. There's a community there where you can kind of read more about it and learn more about it. So you can download the Treat My OCD app or just go to www.treatmyocd.com. I think the International OCD Foundation too, iocdf.org is another really helpful resource for family members, for people who might have OCD or anxiety. So yeah, those are some of the places that I would start. If anything here has kind of resonated with you, I would definitely start with some of those resources.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Jenna, for being on the show. This was super interesting. And everybody, check out the information that Jenna just shared. We will share everything in the show notes, so you can click there. And it was an absolute pleasure to have you.
Awesome. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.